Um, so welcome everyone. I'm sure folk will be drifting in for the next few moments as well. Welcome to this Author Meets Critics session on, well, I'm Chris Cotter, and this is a session on my book that was published in 2020. I have one of the lovely copies here, The Critical Study of Nonreligion, Discourse, Identification and Locality. And I'm very pleased to be joined by my hand-picked panel of critics. We have Linda Woodhead, Morteza Hashemi, Andie Alexander, and Paul-Francois Tremlett, although they are hand-picked, and we've got various connections over the years. I'm not expecting to get an easy ride, and it was my hope that each would bring something different to the table. And I wanted them all to read the book anyway, so this was a good way to force them to do so, commit them to a public event. And they're also probably all a bit more familiar with the book than me right now because it was published last August, and it's mostly been sitting there getting picked up and looked at, a sort of pride thing rather than being consulted since then. So I had to quickly brush up on my concluding chapter, but I'm sure it'll all come flooding back to me in the questions. So the plan is I'm not going to say too much more because this is sort of a platform for the critics to respond to the book, and Linda Woodhead will be kicking off, and Linda will hopefully contextualize the book a little bit. But what I'll do, I'll say a couple of things first about what the critical study of non-religion was intended to be. I'll then introduce Linda. Each speaker will do however long they do, up to a max of 15 minutes, but I'm sure things will probably be much shorter. I'll introduce each speaker as we get to it, then I'll attempt to respond to any questions raised or critiques raised or interesting observations, and then we'll open up for some general discussion if there is any. But all I'm going to say to kick off is just to dive into the title. And I do this at the beginning of the book, so I've called it The Critical Study of Non-Religion, Discourse, Identification, and Locality. The book is sort of intended as both an ethnographic study, which is based upon a number of years' work in the south side of Edinburgh, where I had lived for 16 years until I moved out to West Lothian 2 months ago. So my claim to be a Southsider is no longer valid, but 16 years I think still counts. But it was written, it is an expansion of my doctoral dissertation. But that was motivated primarily by a realization that I was starting to pitch my camp very much in the critical study of religion. Um, with scholars like Talal Asad, Tomoko Masuzawa, Russell McCutcheon, Timothy Fitzgerald, and names sort of that ilk, Bruce Lincoln. And many of those scholars, when I was mentioning, oh, I do non-religion stuff, lots of people would raise eyebrows and be like, oh, that's just further reification of the category of religion. You're just putting a non in front of something that is already critically problematic. What are you doing? And I was getting a bit fed up of that response, in the sense of I could see that there was potential for a lot of good work to be done. On the flip side, lots of people were doing very interesting ethnographic, sociological, anthropological, psychological work looking at this this sort of newly discovered body of the nuns. And in the process, as I saw it, many of whom were indeed reifying the nuns as if they were a coherent group who had some sort of group identity, and not so interested in the critical religion questions that had started to become where I pitched my intellectual tent, as it were. So it was first of all intended as like a rallying cry for a critical study of non-religion, to show critical religion folk that a lot of value existed across the other side, and likewise to bring sort of some more critical nuance to many of the studies that I could see out there. And then I'm already wittering on too much. Discourse, identification, and locality are basically the three methodological strands, I suppose, to how I approach this. Start with the last one, locality. It's a locality-based study. My supervisor at Lancaster University was Kim Knott, so it's perhaps not surprising for those who know her work that I ended up with a locality thrust to what I was doing. Identification, along with that critical shift that happened sort of towards the end of my undergraduate and during master's study. There was a research group set up, connected with the University of Alabama, called Culture on the Edge, and they began looking at Jean-Francois Bayer's work, The Illusion of Cultural Identity, where Bayer talks about how the quotation is something along the lines of these identities that we talk about so pompously are nothing more than operational acts of identification. So things that we think of as identities that are static and fixed are much more fluid and situational and responsive and contested and changing and political and so on. Identification was how I was going to approach my study of non-religion. And then discourse. So this is a discursive study, although it is empirical. It is using sort of discourse from lived discourse, I suppose you could say, but it's primarily interviews were my main tool of data collection, but also Lancaster University, unbeknownst to me when I started there, it was a major centre for critical discourse analysis with Norman Fairclough and Ruth Vodak and others. So that provided another methodological thrust for me. Anyways, I am keen, as I'm sure you are, to start hearing what people thought and what use the book might be for these critics and for you out there. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first critic, Linda Woodhead, who's Distinguished Professor in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University, but also Congrats are in order because she's just recently been appointed as F.T. Morris Professor and Head of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at King's College London. So congratulations, Linda. She's probably familiar to many of you through her leadership of the Religion and Society research program or numerous publications and textbooks, but she's better known to me as the internal examiner on my doctoral thesis. So I have now forgiven you, Linda, not that there was anything to forgive, and I invite you to take the virtual floor.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really here to tell you about the book rather than to be very critical. And there's plenty to tell. I wanted to start, though, with a story that doesn't come from the book. It comes from Charlotte Hobson, who's one of our research assistants on the programme that Laurie is running. And she's one of my PhD students. And before that, she did her MA. And this is about something she found in her MA. She was interested in seeing what young people, 18 to 21, thought should happen at the next coronation. When the Queen dies, whoever it is, Charles, whoever, what should happen and should it still be Christian? So she asked people in the retail, she's working in a big retail chain, she asked young people she was working with what they thought about it. Well, the first problem was they didn't know what a coronation was. They were too young, they'd never seen one. So she had to show them a little clip of it on YouTube. And she showed them the bit where the monarch is sitting in this incredibly grand setting, and the archbishop is holding this crown, and the archbishop's got his hat on, and then the choir strikes up with Zadok the priest. And she said, well, that's what a coronation is, and do you think it should be like that next time? And they mostly said, well, yes, it looks great. And she said, but should it be Christian, given that we're not a Christian country anymore? And they said, was that Christian? Because to them, I mean, they didn't know. They were so out of church, unchurched, that it wasn't, it didn't appear to be religious to them at all. It just appeared to be traditional and a nice bit of ritual. So this question of what is religious, even the most incredibly religious thing, isn't necessarily seen as religious. It's a very complex question, and it's all those complexities of the religious and the non-religious that, particularly the non-religious, that Chris tries to bring clarity and achieves that, I think, for us in this book. Now, he himself says this book can be read as part textbook, part manifesto, and part original empirical study. And that's really helpful. It is all those things. It's also profoundly self-critical. So one really interesting thing that Chris does in this, which is very, theoretical, conceptual study, but with an empirical part, he takes his own studies that he did when he was doing his MA, and he takes some of his interview material from interviews with people in Edinburgh South Side, and he adds more, so he gets new data, but he also revisits that material, which I think is a great thing to do. It's wonderful to go back to your own studies with different theoretical lenses and all you've learned and look at it again. And that's exactly what he does. He says, I was being a little too uncritical when I did that work, and now I'm going to revisit it with the critical approach I'm talking about. So that's I thought that was a wonderful thing about this study. And to cut to the chase, Chris argues that, and he argues it in relation to this data in his interviews, that non-religion as a specific category can't exist without reference to wider religion-related discourses. And through in-depth discussion of discourses about things like multiculturalism and meaning and morality and so on in his interviews, he demonstrates that. And he shows that some can be described without any reference to religious phenomena, and others can't be described without recourse to contextual constructions of religion and or non-religion. So you have to kind of, as Wittgenstein said, look and see before you pronounce, and first look. He also applies this to religion-related identities of both individuals and communities. And as he just said, he views them as operational acts rather than as fixed things. So he's showing us a picture that is more in which we take different identities within different contexts, and so does what we think about religion and non-religion. And so this is where his locality approach comes in. He says locality isn't just a backdrop. Locality really shapes how these Southsiders, what religion and non-religion is for them. It's integral to it. So he does bring in Kim Nott's work in that really interesting way into this discussion of non-religion. So Chris has one of the really constructive and helpful suggestions is that we should think about religion-related studies. We shouldn't think about a new field of non-religion studies any more than religious studies. We should be doing religion-related studies. I think that's one of the most helpful conclusions from his book. So scholars, he thinks, should not cease all empirical work on social phenomena deemed religious or non-religious, or abandon those categories altogether, but they should be aware of how deeply problematic those categories often are, and they should be, in his words, relentlessly self-conscious in their approach to religion and the other than religious. So I've tried to just lay out the heart of his argument, and I'll just make one, well, not particularly critical, but comes from me comment at the end, and that's about power. I think that power is just woven into everything that Chris is looking at and everything that he's saying, and that it calls for attention in its own right. Because going back to my opening example, the people who didn't see the coronation as Christian were people who were from a Christian background. I mean, they're probably non-religious. Now, if there'd been some a Muslim in her group of people she talked to, they would have seen that was Christian. It would probably been more apparent. So there's always power implicit in this, and so there is in whether we think that religious studies is a thing or not, a discipline or not, and something that's, all these things are related to where we're positioned and how we're positioned. And one little critical point, I think it's absolutely fine to say identity is an operational matter and it's contextual and it's fluid and blah blah blah. Well, it's not for some people if they're in situations where they have to assert their identity against dominant cultures and forces that don't want them to be who they are. That's a kind of luxury, that operational view, for some people. So again, you have to look and see what's going on in the way these things are being used and who benefits. That's me, Chris.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Linda. I will resist the temptation to just immediately start responding to points there. But I should also say that the religion-related terminology is very much, and I'm indebted to Johannes Quack, who is in this call, for that terminology from his article on Method and Theory in the Study of Religion. So before I get tempted to start responding there, my next critic, who might be more critical, who knows, is Morteza Hashemi, who is lecturer in sociology at the University of Bristol and also an honorary fellow in the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh, where he recently completed a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship looking at blood donation among Scottish Shias, amongst other things. And indeed, we met because we were the two Leverhulme Fellows in the School of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at the same time. He's the author of Theism and Atheism in a Post-Secular Age, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2017, and is a co-editor with myself of a long-awaited and long overdue edited collection, Religion and Non-Religion in Fortress Europe, Perspectives on Belief, Migration, and Identity in a Time of Polarized Politics. It is coming if anyone from Bloomsbury is here. Pandemic got in the way. I think we can still use that excuse, Morteza, but for now, the floor is over to you.
Thank you. So as Chris said, my name is Morteza Hashemi. I'm a sociologist by training, but part of my problem in the past few years was that I was going around the different departments. I was in social anthropology, and now my friend Chris is in religion studies. So I'm traveling between departments, and that's quite helpful for me because I learned the terminology and the stuff, that the way that you talk about the same subject that we talk about. And this book was also quite informative for me. I couldn't find many points that I disagree with. Like many sociologists, we are trained to show that phenomena, stuff that are in the world, they don't have clear boundaries that the way that we want to see. And this is quite significant in religion studies and sociology of religion as well. If I say 20 or 40 or 50% of the sociological texts are are about showing that, look, religion is not what you think necessarily. It has, you need to deconstruct it. There are many religions and there are many forms of religiosity, and basically we don't know what we are talking about when we are talking about religion. So we are looking forward the similar types of arguments which show the plurality of non-religion, atheism, the topic that I have worked on as well. So I found that aspect of the book quite interesting and helpful. But as Linda said, at the beginning of the book, Chris suggests that this is a textbook, manifesto, and original empirical study, and I think that's true. That's a good description of the missions of the book. Nevertheless, my expertise is in empirical study aspect of the book more than anything else. And my own critical point that I want to raise is here, that I feel like the book, the book focuses on one part of Edinburgh and the concept of locality and so on and so forth. It is helpful. It is a perfect empirical study. But when I was reading it, I was thinking, well, you could kind of remove most of the parts of the empirical study and still the conclusion more or less would be the same. The theoretical foundation somehow assumes the conclusion, and the empirical study doesn't seem to me that improves that as well that much. So the limited, I mean, your empirical study sounds quite limited to one part of the city. For situations like this, I would prefer, as a sociologist, again, I'm not in the field of religion studies, but as a sociologist, I would suggest uh, choosing Edinburgh as the main site, or Edinburgh and Glasgow, Edinburgh, another city with different combination of religiosity and so on, and comparing these two sites, or restricting the topic to one, Scotland, one city, or something like that. So it seems to me that the theoretical foundation is quite ambitious. It delivers the argument. The theoretical aspect is quite strong, but the empirical aspect is not quite ambitious. And that was the only critical point that I wanted to raise. Yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Morteza. I'm getting let off lightly here thus far. Andie, Paul, get the big guns. Well, that's great. Again, I'll resist responding directly to Morteza, but I feel I should also just say a bit about the structure of the book and so on. For those of you who don't know it, I could be posting links and things in here. So it's published by Bloomsbury in their Advances in Religious Studies series, which I believe will mean that a paperback should be coming out within the next year now, and this series does seem to get paperback, so it should become suddenly much more affordable. And yes, I like that my two colleagues before me have pulled out that textbook, manifesto, and original study aspect. I should have been going straight with that. So if you're looking for an introduction to what I would describe as the critical study of religion, I try to do that in the book, and sort of lots of people have been asking me, well, thanks, Vanessa. Would ask, what do you mean by be more critical? What do you mean by the critical study of religion? So to have to finally write this and articulate it was useful for me. And then I've since used it plenty of times in teaching. Students have gone, well, read this bit of my book because I've made that articulation. I tried to give as up-to-date a survey as I could of research on the non-religious and non-religion as I saw it at the time of writing. So that was summer 2019. The final sort of substantive update was made things have moved on, of course. But if you're looking for particularly just the first chapter, I try and give the contemporary non-religious landscape in the UK and beyond. Now, of course, there are plenty of omissions in there, but I tried to be fairly comprehensive and not just stick to my UK and Scotland context, but equally foreground there was a bit, because particularly this conference and so on, you'll see there's so much material on the US and now with Canada and so on. I thought it was good to sort of big up my home context, as it were. And then, yes, there's the theoretical aspect and the empirical aspect. So there's a lot going on, and I'll resist going any further than that. But just to say that you can almost pull out that first chapter from the rest of the book to use as a kind of overview for students and so on. It was written with that intention, and I explicitly say I'll put the critical religion questions to the side for the sake of writing a nice clear chapter, and then we'll move on. Excellent. Well, thanks again, Morteza. So our next speaker, Andie, it's you, is Andie Alexander. He's a doctoral student in American religious cultures at Emory University in Atlanta. And she's recently been appointed / promoted, I don't know what, to managing co-editor of the Religious Studies Project, which is, I guess, where we initially came into contact. Her work examines the ways in which post 9/11 rhetorics of inclusivity and pluralism implicitly Americanize and Protestantize Muslims in the United States. She serves on the Executive Council for the North American Association for the Study of Religion and works with the collaborative Culture on the Edge that I mentioned earlier, and indeed is co-edited a volume in Equinox's Working with Culture on the Edge series titled Fabricating Authenticity that I think we can expect within the year. So over to you, Andie.
Thanks, Chris. Let's see. So in some ways, I will, of course, echo what the others have said a bit. I found this just so critical and necessary as a book. Like, it was something that I feel like we really kind of needed to have in my like working in American religions and the conversations that I often encounter. Your book, I think, very nicely addresses many discrepancies that I see between the sort of dominant approaches in the subfield of American religions and the seeming tensions between them and the critical study of religion, however one might understand that. So I just think that this is a fantastic intervention into those discourses and something that is absolutely needed in the field. I particularly, I'll go through a couple of points just to highlight some of the aspects, because again, my strengths and expertise are not in the empirical research, as I also have a more focus on discourse analysis in my own work. And so I think that your shift, of course, from the individual to their discourses, how they are utilized, how they are employed, is already something that makes your empirical study stand out amongst many that I've seen. I'm not overly familiar with scholarship on the nuns or the non-religious in the United States, but what I have seen certainly falls within some of the, or falls in the categories of the issues that you address, and immediately sort of linking certain claims, certain discourses to this idea of religion to some sort of transhuman understanding of belief, of spirituality, that goes largely unquestioned and unacknowledged in those works. And so I think that that already is just this excellent intervention. And I particularly like the language you had of types of narrative, because it helps us to shift how we think about these discourses. Given that, you know, modern conceptions of the individual are predominantly the product of, you know, post-Reformation Protestant political philosophy, right? Of this personal, private, distinct individual operating within a society. It's very easy to intentionally or not fall back on the idea that identity is somehow intrinsic and distinct from the worlds that we're in, which of course, I guess to skip to the end, they're not, right? It is that locality is absolutely a part of how our identities are constructed, which is why they, of course, as you know, you quote by Bayer, like, there's no such thing as identity, only operational acts of identification, which is not to say that people are disingenuous or that they are somehow misleading in how they present themselves, but that how we understand ourselves within certain contexts necessarily changes. And you know, based on the concerns, where we are, like specifically. And so I think bridging that analysis with the shift to discourse and with a focus on the ways in which we continually construct and reconstruct our identities in certain moments and spaces is just a wonderful bridge, really. I think you said this in the podcast that you recorded with Bree. I think you said you wanted this book to be a bridge between critical study of religion and, you know, empirical studies of, you know, what's happening on the ground, right? And I think that it is exactly that. And part because, at least to me, I see it as Dr. Woodhead noted, the presence of issues of power that are strung throughout the book, but not in a way that's I don't know, in your face so much. I think that it's very helpful to see that there's so much bound up in the ways in which people construct their identities, and specifically with regard to power. And so it reminded me a lot of Lincoln's 13th thesis on method, right? Like, I see this as sort of what you're doing, right, is the shift from truths to truth claims within the regimes of truth, right? That's, to me, how I see these different parts kind of playing out and addressing each one of those, and how they're both generally understood within the field, and then maybe ways that we need to actually approach them. And the focus on locality and structures, it actually reminded me, I was talking to Miranda Simmons recently, and she brought up the metaphor, Toni Morrison's metaphor of the fishbowl, right? Like, how, like, you know, it's this like structure that makes this particular space happen, and that, like, we have to recognize the fishbowl so that we can actually understand the ways in which our identities are working. And so in that sense, I found this to be a really fantastic and helpful book. I mean, it's like for my own work and my own interests, especially, because it really starts to complicate ideas that I think often, at least in my subfield, get taken for granted. And I did want to mention something, though, Chris, I'm not sure how you would feel about this. And part of what Dr. Woodhead, I know your somewhat critique, I I definitely understand what you're saying, but I also think the issue of fluid identities for marginalized groups who have to continually assert themselves, like on the one hand, yes, that makes a lot of sense. But I also think that, I mean, if we factor in issues or the ways in which code switching comes into play specifically for marginalized, racialized communities, we still see a fluidity of identity. It's one that is, it's more that the fluidity, I think, is a forced rather than the lack of it, because they have to present differently in the workplace potentially. So Chris, I don't know if that's something that if that aligns somewhat with what you're thinking, or if not, but overall, I think that's about all I have. But I thought this was fantastic, and I really enjoyed it. I just think that I really hope that scholars in American religions pick this up, because it's something that will be relevant far beyond just non-religion, I think.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Andie. And again, a few things that I could respond to just there. I'm trying to keep a note. Problem will be there'll be no chance of me actually being able to read what I'm scrolling in a felt tip on a bit of scrap paper beside me, because I was that prepared. But thanks very much. And I'm still waiting for the devastating critique. Paul, is that going to be you? I don't know, but thanks very much, Andie. And we should move on finally to Paul-Francois Tremlett, who's senior lecturer in religious studies at the Open University, where his current research interests span contemporary intersections of religion and politics, space, nature, and the city, classical theories of religion, post-structuralism and postmodernism, and theories of religion and social change. His publications include books on Lévi-Strauss and Tyler, articles on bricolage and counter-archaeology, and his most recent book, Towards a New Theory of Religion and Social Change, Sovereignties and Disruptions. Paul, thank you, and I'll pass the floor over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel, and thanks to the organisers of the conference, which looks fantastic. I was just thinking about the other contributions, and I was thinking that what they all have in common is an interest in methodology and how you set that up in the book. And I don't think I'm going to be departing from that. But me being me, it'll probably sound more confrontational. So in this book, I've written this out, so I'm going to be reading as if I'm in the third person and as if you're not present, but bear with me. In this book, Cotter sets out to address two important questions. First, what is non-religion? And second, why does non-religion matter? And in the opinion of this reviewer, the book provides a rich and profound response to the first question that falls short on the second. I hope in what I've got to say, I can do justice both to what I see as the book's strengths and to its weaknesses. So Cotter situates himself in the book in a critical tradition in religious studies, associated with figures such as Talal Assad, Timothy Fitzgerald, Naomi Goldenberg, Craig Martin, Russell McCutcheon, and Tomoko Masazawa, while drawing also from the emergent field of the study of non-religion and the writings of Lois Lee and Johann Quack, among others. As well as passing references to Pierre Bourdieu and Michel Foucault, Cotter's immersion and fluency in contemporary theory in religious studies is clear. Yet the theorist he turns to at the key moments in the book is Jean-Francois Bayer, a French political scientist who has written about state formation and globalization in Africa, and who quite obviously stands outside religious studies. This is significant. That wasn't me. I don't know what that was. Maybe an expression of shock, surprise, confirmation bias.
Bayer trying to get into the room.
Yeah, extraordinary. A key influence on Bayar's work is Gilles Deleuze, notable for his language of rhizomes, assemblages, and deterritorializations. And there is a striking Deleuzian or postmodern inflection to Cotter's characterization of non-religious identities as relational acts, emergent in particular historico-spatial contexts, as opposed to fixed or unitary substances, and of non-religion as something performative, relational, and situational, as opposed to a fixed set of beliefs or dispositions. Non-religion then is less a thing or an object or a substance than a moment, a flow or a liquid, an elusive emergent node that articulates and networks, a potential that may form a solid structure, but may by the same token simply dissipate into nothing. Cotter's vignette and the careful analysis of the words of his interlocutors deftly opens out this improvised and provisional being of non-religion, but perhaps apprehensive on behalf of his reader of the strange spectral figure that his research has conjured into existence, Cotter turns to discourse to give his non-religion an aura of solidity. Towards the end of the book, he assures his reader that the performed blasé indifference to religion that he encountered in Edinburgh's South Side is, and I quote, entangled with a dominant liberal secularist discourse extolling religion-related moderation and conviviality in interpersonal interactions, and that demonizes militancy or extremism. So discourse performs three functions in Cotter's argument. First, it affirms Cotter's critical credentials. Discourse and discourse analysis offer, now that Marxism has been stripped of its teleological guarantee, a means to ideology critique, to which Cotter nods on two occasions, where he writes of demystifying and unmasking the ideological functions of categories such as religion. Second, given that non-religion does not refer to any specific population, group, or institution, discourse gives non-religion a solidity, not just in the South Side, but across and beyond it. Importantly, this is no niche subcultural discourse, but a key element of a culturally dominant, nationally pervasive discursive formation, which, if Georg Simmel was right, is a structuring structure of Europe's modernity. Thirdly, then, Cotter's turn to discourse means that if we began the book without an object of study, we end it with a distinct sociological object that can be examined like any crystal. On two occasions early on, Cotter describes the book as a manifesto, perhaps because of the polymethodic approach he has adopted to conjure this object out of thin air, to give non-religion the sociological visibility it otherwise would not have. It is worth noting that Southside itself is carefully constructed as a relatively bounded and coherent context, bestowing upon it a similarly questionable solid quality. These moves are important because elsewhere Cotter is highly critical of reifications of categories and attributions of substance through which, for example, religion with a capital R has been created as a solid object for scholarly analysis. At the top of this review, I indicated that I would be writing to two questions: what is non-religion and why does non-religion matter? Cotter's careful analysis allows his reader to understand non-religion in terms of relational, situational, and performative acts, which, because there are no standard texts, no enduring institutions, and no stable populations, can be grasped in terms of discourse. At one level, then, both questions have been answered. We learn what non-religion is, and we learn that non-religion matters, because the study of it tells us something interesting and important about the constitution of culture and society in the today not so United Kingdom. That's a little joke for those among us who actually live here, God help us. But I want to return to Bayer to pursue the postmodern or perhaps Deleuzian dimensions of non-religion. The fact that non-religion is not a thing or an object, but a contingent relation that emerges through specific situated acts and performances, and what this means for the way societies and religions are understood and studied. Postmodern methodologies such as deconstruction take the instability of structures and objects for their point of departure. Not just Jean-Francois Bayer and Gilles Deleuze, but Bruno Latour, Donna Haraway, Ernesto Laclau, and Jane Bennett, among many others, insist on the social as a plane of interactions, flows, and openings, and the study of social worlds as the study of processes through which acts and performances generate gravity and become attractors, drawing other elements in to revolve around them until eventually they dissipate and new attractors emerge, generating new gravities and new arrangements in the process. But this point of departure is marginal to the critical tradition of religious studies with which Cotter identifies. So why does this study of non-religion matter? Because it draws into view a range of wider questions about theory and method and the constitutional politics of religious studies as a field of study, which are only hinted at in Cotter's otherwise excellent study.
Thank you very much, Paul. And very well written and read, I must say. There were points of that I was like, why didn't I write that? The book is hopefully well written, but there were some excellent passages in that. So well, first off, thanks to all four of you, Linda, Morteza, Andie, and Paul. I'll offer some sort of response, although I don't think I'm going to have a huge amount to say. But we've got a lot of people in the room, and so hopefully I can sort of respond. The four of you can feel free to have a dialogue with me right now as I respond to things, and then perhaps we can get a conversation going with others who haven't yet read the book, or who might have been completely put off reading it, or encouraged to read it, or just want to know a little bit more about what it is, because I realize that the five of us who have been speaking thus far are in a sort of privileged position where we may not realize the obvious things that need to be said for those who don't know anything about the work. Just and thank you all for being so broadly supportive of the work. It's very intimidating. This is my first sort of event of this sort after the actual PhD Viva. This is probably the next most intimidating event. So it's good to know that it has gone down well. I think just to respond, sort of Andie and Linda were, your sort of points of questioning it came around the fluidity of identification and that sort of issue of power and how some, I think, Linda made the point that how some don't have the option of being fluid and have identities kind of thrust upon them, or are viewed in particular ways by dominant powers in societies, and don't have the luxury of this sort of fluidity of which I was talking. And then Andie pointed to how fluidity can be a way to sort of resist, or in fact a very necessary way of navigating certain hegemonic power structures.
Chris, can I just jump in, because my point
Absolutely.
was slightly different about identity, which was that, and also in response to Andie, it's not that you're. Of course, there can be cases where it's just ascribed very heavily to somebody. I was thinking about where, imagine. I don't imagine, if you're trans, say, you don't say, oh, I've just chosen to have this. The whole point is you're saying, no, this is who I am. I knew from a very early age that this is who I am. And I have had an identity misattributed to me. That's not fluid. So you have to really assert that. The same for some religious or non-religious people. No, I haven't chosen this. This is absolutely who I am.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks, Linda. So I think what I would want to say there is that in all this talk about religion and non-religion being operational acts of identification, and them being part of larger structures of everyone's got intersectional identifications, and they're all operational to some extent. Now that would not be to say that any number of those could not be entirely considered core to that individual's being, immutable in some way, shape, or form. So I wouldn't want to be doing violence potentially to someone's, say, fervent religious belief or non-belief, if we're going to say that, or to their gender identity, sexual identification, all these sorts of things. But the operational aspect still stands in that all identifications are relational. So regardless of how one perceives oneself, one will always be, these things become meaningful through through interactions with others who might position you differently, and other power structures which might. So it's through these acts of positioning that, I guess, personal identity matters. Obviously, it matters to the individual on an individual basis, but in terms of as social scholars, it's through the points of articulation and interaction and relation that they become, through the performance that they become interesting, and these acts of identification, they flow both ways as well. So a person can be misidentified. That is an act of identification, by others. So I wouldn't, my key thing here would be I wouldn't want to be doing violence to individual felt identities by talking about identity as fluid and operational and subjective and situational and so on. It's more to place it into that relational framework of it's how these interactions with others happen, how one's felt identity is interpreted by others, and how that articulation in discourse and in performance, etc. That's where things get interesting. Also, just since I brought up Andie there as well, I love that fishbowl metaphor. I spent so long in the first year of the PhD agonizing about, because I got so into the critical study of religion. I was like, I want to do empirical work, but every single thing I'm thinking of, it's like, how do I justify this choice? How do I, you can criticize everything, and I knew I wanted to do critical discourse analysis, and I wanted a body of data, but I really wanted data from real people, because I'd started doing that already, and probably because of some inner feeling that it was more authentic. So I was going through all of this trouble, and how do I get real people but do discourse analysis, and how do I justify my selection of people and all that. Went through the ringer, and then eventually it was like, look, where I live, hey, instead of saying, are you non-religious, come and be part of my study, I was able to say, are you a Southsider? Do you live and work in the South Side? Come and be part of my study. So from the beginning of doing that, sort of liberated me from a lot of those questions of how do I deal with that word religion or non-religion in there. So, but I like that. So the South Side became the fishbowl into which I put the discourse, as it were. So the just like water in a fishbowl is going to have existence beyond. It is not in the shape of a fishbowl, but that was the sort of containing metaphor, the orienting metaphor that I put onto the study. The South Side was going to be my container for discourse, as it were. Morteza, and I think Paul sort of hinted at this a bit as well, in terms of like, what is the empirical study adding here, and I think that's a fair point, in that the nature of it is that this began as a doctoral project that was completed in 2016, and then I had a little bit of time off, and then rewrote it as a book and updated it and made it more palatable. but as with doctoral work, you know, they grow arms and legs, and you end up perhaps with some redundancies in there. Now, I do not think the empirical material is redundant in any way, shape, or form, and then I hope everyone who would read it would agree that it's very interesting.
Well, neither am I.
Yeah, it's very interesting material. But and that's good to know, Morteza. But I think your point was that I could have made the same argument without necessarily having it there. And I probably could have. Maybe I could have separated them out into, you know, separate books, and then, as you say, had a sort of more had more space to do the ethnography with justice, I guess. The encouraging thing, though, to say is that this is still a work in progress, but my Leave Your Human project was taking this approach and going, okay, what happens if we look at some different places? So lots of the work that has been done on non-religion up until now, empirical work, will be, it tends to be from sort of urban centers in some way, shape, or form, because that's where the organized groups are, or what have you, and there's a lot more people to get access to. So what I first of all wanted to do was do comparisons between different sizes of localities and different contexts. You know, see, is there a difference to being not religious in the center of the city of Edinburgh, or how about in a smallish village in the Scottish borders? So for my Leave Your Human project, I called it a comparative study of unbelief in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Those of you who know me will know that I am Northern Irish, but have lived in Scotland since 2004. So there was an autobiographical element in there as well. I wanted to do sort of a comparative study, building off these insights, but looking at a provincial town and a village in each context. So there was Peterhead and Moffat in Scotland. So the Peterhead's a fishing town right up on the northeast coast of Scotland, and Moffat is sort of a village mostly frequented now by bikers and hikers, and it's just across the border from England, in Dumfries and Galloway. And then in Northern Ireland, Omagh in County Tyrone, and Brashane in County Antrim. So each of these was chosen because of quite a different hegemonic religion-related identification in its context. Peterhead, the Scottish fishing village, there's a lot of religious activity, lots of churches. It's predominantly Christianity, but there's many different nationalities because of the fishing history. You know, religion's a lot more, I suppose, in your faith than it would be in even the south side of Edinburgh and so on. And the two Northern Irish examples, one's in a predominantly unionist, so corresponds largely with Protestant area, and one's in a nationalist, corresponding largely with Catholic area, and so on. So the idea here was to build up what's the difference between urban and rural, between Scotland and Northern Ireland, and also just to provide some ethnographic material for these two regions of the UK, which tend to get a bit pushed out. Lots of studies on the UK will predominantly be England and Wales, and that makes sense because of you know, just population sizes and then ease of research. But I wanted to correct that a little bit. So hopefully the next book, Morteza, will have a bit more of that. I've argued that locality and local particularity and situatedness is important. So let's see what happens when I do the same work, but expanded. So a questionnaire with, I think I got close to 1,800 responses across Scotland and Northern Ireland for the questionnaire, and then about 15 interviews and some ethnographic work in each those contexts. So we shall see. And Paul, I don't really have too much to say in direct response, except as I've said, I very much enjoyed the flow and how you broke everything down in terms of what discourse does for the work, and how non-religion is constructed or deconstructed in the book. I think perhaps it might be expedient for us to have a conversation right now about those bigger issues that you thought I did not perhaps get to. That was sort of tantalizingly sort of hung in the book. So perhaps you could just say a little bit more about the sort of final few sentences of your response there, and we could move on with that.
I don't know if I'll do that, but I will say, why do you think you need discourse? Why do we think we need to make it solid? Why do we think we need an object? Because the book is a conjuring trick.
Yeah.
If I'm being uncharitable, but that is nevertheless what is performed. We start with nothing, and then, hey presto, we get something, the solid discourse. Now that's what, let's be clear, we all do this conjuring trick, right? So I'm not saying this is something a trick that you've perpetrated on us, because that's very much the nature of but why do we do it? Why do we need it? And it's a sort of provocation to Linda, really. Okay, yeah, people make identifications that I'm really this or I'm really that, but actually, whether we're looking in a micro moment of time or whether we're looking at a really long period of time, there are no substances, there are no real objects. There's just change. That's all there is, change. I mean, that's what we need to understand.
Yeah. My immediate response is that I just think it is exactly what we do, because if we didn't, if you are particularly inclined to be sort of a social constructivist, as I am, and some others probably are as well, then if you end up with all this deconstruction, then what is there left to do? You have to construct, you have to conjure to say something. So that would just be my.
Because that's a provocation to me as well, Chris. So I'll help you out there. You're making a metaphysical point there. You sound like a particular school of ancient Greek philosophy. But I'm making a more sociological or perhaps even a psychological point, which is that for many people in the world, your identity is not being affirmed around you by society, by culture, by other people. And therefore, you have to do an awful lot of work to maintain that identity and to give it substance. And that's a human and a social necessity. That's my point.
Could I jump in quickly? Because I do agree with what you're saying. I mean, and back to what Chris was saying earlier, is like I don't see looking at the sort of discursive aspect of identity. To me, it's not a move to invalidate how someone themselves identifies, how they feel to themselves, right? But rather, the thing that I can see, or the thing that I can actually engage, is how they talk about that, how those conversations happen in a social space. And I think, because you're right, in the sense of like there is constant harm and violence done to marginalized communities on a regular basis. And I think, at least in my mind, shifting our focus and our understanding of identity to a more discursive social thing, if you will, actually would make more space for marginalized communities to operate within that framework, because now it's something that, because we can't ignore the social aspect of it, I guess. And so if it's not just a singular, personal, incontestable, immutable truth, but rather something that we acknowledge as necessarily social, which means rethinking how we understand identity, individuals, how we operate within a society, which is not, of course, an easy task by any means. But if we understand experience and individuals in this way, and focus on the social elements, we can then have productive conversations that would, I think, at least work to, it would make more space for folks who feel, who do have to constantly fight, resist to assert their identities, and feel like there's this sort of erasure, or I mean, not feel like, I mean, because there is, of course, but I think that that is partly why I find this approach to be so useful in approaching identity formation.
Thanks, Andie. There's some sort of interesting, there's an interesting conversation happening in the chat, and I think we should probably, I should open the floor a bit to encourage folk to jump in. But this is reminding me of an analogy, and I make it in this book, and I made it in an earlier publication as well, that a lot of what we're doing here sort of falls a bit foul of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, if we know that from quantum mechanics, that where we have a subatomic particle, and the only way that we can detect its where it is to shine light on it and see it, but through that very act of shining it, you irrevocably alter the path of the particle that you're trying to study. And similarly, in social research, particularly of concern to us, religion and non-religion, when we intervene, when we try and ask questions, when we try and find things that are of interest, that very act of intervention, the very querying, the forcing things into discourse, can invariably alter the thing that we were trying to study. The penultimate chapter of the book, I talk about indifference, which is building off a few years of discussion with Johannes and Lois and Joe Blancombe and some others that are here. So how do we study positions of indifference? Well, if we go out there and we try and force an articulation of indifference, even if an articulation of indifference is thus not indifferent because there's been an active position taken. So, and then on the other hand, you can go, well, we just need to look for naturally occurring data in some way, shape, or form. And as I'm sure this conversation, especially in this circle of those of us who are interested in things that people are not, trying to find naturally occurring data can be nigh on impossible. Do you watch movies and look for all the points at which religion is no longer a theme? Well, you can do that. You can start to pay attention to popular culture and notice shifts and changes and trends, and you can listen to everyday conversations and do ethnographic observation. But unfortunately, these things require funding. And if you go, I want funding to just observe, but I'm really looking for nothing. Unfortunately, we tend to go in with research questions in mind. I want to look at this because I think it'll tell me more about that. And once we're doing that, I think, we've already kind of influenced things a bit, perhaps, or our own agendas come in. And I'm sure it does in my it absolutely does in my own work as well. But I try and be relentlessly self-conscious throughout about what those agendas are. So, is anyone in the room? I'm going to try and see if I can see hands and things. Vanessa can maybe keep me right. So Dan's asking in the chat. So if you do have a question, please post it in the chat or raise a hand. But I'll just deal with Dan's. It's the intent of the book to provide a universal lens through which a critical study of non-religion can be viewed, like beyond the UK. I would say, my immediate reaction is to say no, in the sense of I wouldn't want to claim what. So I know the title, The Critical Study of Non-Religion, is quite definitive, but that's part of where the manifesto comes in a sense. I wanted to be like, look, we can do the critical study of non-religion. I'm going to write this book and lay it down. Let's do it. We can do better. Technically, it probably should be more like a critical study of non-religion. It's my data is situated and location based, and any other study that's going to even take the same discursive approach is going to hopefully come up with something quite different. But through the excavation of the discourses and the mapping of the dominant religion-related discourses in any context, we then build up more of a picture of how we can have fruitful conversations between different contexts, and we can trace discourses at the micro, meso and macro level. Discourses are national, they're transnational, they're local, they're historical, transhistorical, and so on. So it's going to depend. Linda, you're wanting to
So
come
I've
in
got a
on that,
question, Chris, in relation to that. You wrote the book, well, you did your thesis quite a while ago now. Have studies of non-religion appeared since that are more critical in the sense that you intend?
It's been one of those things that, particularly after finishing a thesis, you take a little bit of a whew, and then get back into it. And there's been a lot more. I mean, everything is especially with the Understanding Unbelief program, and now with this non-religion in a complex future program and so on. There's a lot more work happening, and it's becoming a lot more difficult to keep on top of all the material. And I think by sheer sort of critical mass and scholarship building up, the work that is emerging is by and large a lot more attentive to not being so blasé with terminology, and seeing answers to questions on surveys as interesting because they are how that individual interpreted that survey in a certain discursive context, not just this is fact, as some early studies might have been. So yes, there's been a lot. I wouldn't want to pull out anything in particular. Just say that the trend has been encouraging in recent years. I felt like I had something, I was going somewhere with that, and my brain has just died. But yes, there's been somewhat encouraging. At the same time, I do like to, I'll make another point that I make in the book, and because I mentioned particularly there the Understanding Unbelief program. I remember when the results were presented in Rome 2 years ago, and and this is in one of the Understanding Unbelief publications, there was the sort of questions looking at 6 different nations. So I think they were the UK, US, Denmark, Japan, China, and Brazil. And there was a question about values, or you know, what are the most important things in your life, and so on. And they'd asked some representative samples in each nation of atheists and agnostics and the general population. And the results were, you know, they gave the sort of top 5 most important values or things for each, for atheists, agnostics, and for general population. And what you could see looking down this nice presentation was that that family and freedom were largely the top 2 for both atheists, agnostics, and the general population in all these 6 nations, with a couple of slight variations. But the way that this was presented was, you know, look at how similar everyone is here. Look at all this commonality. We've been focusing on difference. Perhaps we need to be looking at how religious and non-religious people are more the same. And my critical brain was going, this is Templeton funding speaking here, because Templeton funding is interested in how we are all the same, and so on. My brain went, but family and freedom are very interesting discursive signifiers. They have power that someone can have the freedom of religion and freedom from religion. We can have family meaning a heteronormative family, or meaning the right to have a family. You know, it could mean, you know, pro-life or pro-choice. It could mean all these things. So these are potent signifiers. So my point that I'm going at here is that there, you know, there's still work to be done, but that the questions that we're asking can sometimes really influence the research that comes out. If we go into things asking about what's meaningful in people's lives, what are the big questions that animate people's lives, and so on, that's all very interesting. But what that's going to end up doing is producing models of non-religion which are quite religion-like, and which are all about profound stuff and meaningful stuff, and the like question of the life, universe, and everything. And that could end up sort of reinforcing some of our existing models of religion, and formatting non-religion according to a sort of predetermined, well, religion's about meaningful stuff, right? So let's ask non-religious people what's their meaningful stuff, and then you end up with a construction of non-religion as it's all about these alternative ways of life, universe, and everything. So we've got to be careful. And I think some of the research out there is not as careful as others, and some could be if the right questions were asked. But we need to look at how the questions have been asked and what are the motivating factors behind things. Are there any hands up? I don't think so. You've all done very well to last an hour and 20 minutes on this. Oh, Marty.
I'm in Canada, and I'm a semi-retired psychologist that is very interested in all of these areas because of a book I'm writing on humanism. I'm a humanist chaplain here in Canada. And what my comment, and I'm interested in how your other scholars are going to respond to this, it's kind of following up a comment that Linda Woodhead made about a trans young person who may not have any support in the community. So her locality is very non-supportive, but inside of that, there is some kind of self-identification, you know, it's very fluid gender. My comment in the chat is, as a psychologist and listening to people describe themselves now for close to 40 to 50 years, that changes, and it changes daily. So not only does the postmodern world talk about the conceptualization based on location, I think the self and the individual is extremely fluid. And I was wondering how in your research you try to stabilize, or I think somebody said in the chat, try to fix a point when you ask people questions about what they believe or what they do, because I saw so much fluidity in my clients that I began to believe that the self-concept was almost a non-existent phenomenon and was just nailed down depending on what they needed at that moment.
Absolutely. Well, that was part of my motivation, Marty, was that recognition that whether it's surveys or interviews and so on, what you're getting is an individual at a particular moment, and so to make prescriptions from that about this individual believes this or is that, who knows whether it's something that it has been sincerely held over a long amount of time and is integral to their sense of being, or if it was how they were on that day. Now, my argument would be, and I think many others would make the argument too, everyone's like that. We get around that by looking at lots and lots and lots of individuals and getting lots and lots and lots of instances, and then perhaps you can build up a sort of broader picture and look for commonalities and similarities and so on. I looked at individuals, but how they were utilizing discursive tropes, how they were talking about religion, what themes were coming through, and how that tied in to their local and national particularity, and what the resources were that they had to draw on. And so I diverted attention from that by going, well, I'm going to try and map the tools that are available to people rather than trying to map the people. But it is if we're going to try and understand an individual, well, then we could probably spend our entire lifetimes studying an individual.
But I wanted to, it made me think too, because part of it, I think, and when we're talking about how individuals identify, and if our willingness or anyone's sort of willingness to assume a presence of, a personal, sincerely held belief or a relationship between that identity that has been presented and some understanding of religion is something that happens when we don't disagree with what they present. But if there is any level of disagreement, if there is any level of I don't know, disbelief of the interviewer, I don't know why I would say that, but that when we disagree with that, we're not readily going to say, oh, well, then that is religious or that is non-religious. It's like, well, no, this won't fit how we understand certain things. So I think that it's that relationship too that we have to be cognizant of, because it's not just what is being said by the individual, but also, like Chris, what you're saying, the questions that are being asked, but the presence and role of the interviewer in making those connections. Because, and this is where I think it goes back to being, relentlessly self-conscious and tying in all of J.C. Smith's work, is that we have to recognize what it is we bring to every situation and analysis and interpretation of what's being said, which is why, at least I would think it's crucial to avoid interpreting something as explicit fact, like in a social sense, or somehow linked to a broader understanding of humans generally.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andie. Yeah, and just with a bit of chat, and we'll have maybe get Johannes's question in just before we finish. But with a bit of conversation in the chat there, I just wanted to reiterate that I think asking, going back to, I was saying, if you only ask about the big questions, then you construct non-religion as being about the big question. I think asking about big questions and being interested in human responses to big questions and so on is absolutely a worthy research endeavor. But it should always be framed as exactly that. This is a study on people's responses to these certain questions, which are culturally deemed to be big in various Western post-Christian contexts, right? Not as it's when that gets framed as these are inherently big questions, and or we'll see how the non-religious respond to these inherently big questions that things get problematic. So it's absolutely okay to go. I'm interested in how people respond to these questions. It's just that overlap. Johannes, 3 minutes. Is it something that we can do?
Yes, I try to be brief. I mean, thanks for, I think the book is a very valuable and important contribution, and I appreciate the discussion so far, and I would love to discuss further how often you can step into the same river, and what kind of substance it is that we think is constantly changing, and so on and so forth. But for me, it's kind of a déjà vu with other empirical studies that try to draw at the same time on a discursive approach, because I mean, there's this fundamental philosophy of science on the one hand, and then there's the empirical encounter on the other hand. And my question comes back to some of the points that I said about the relationship between the empirical work and the theory, and your reflexivity, which I also think is very skillfully going through the whole book. But my question is, you also point to ethnography, and I'm an anthropologist, so I always interested in that. And there's this trope within anthropology that you go somewhere, and then the encounter with the field, you know, shakes everything that you thought initially, and you know, come up with new terms and new concepts, whatever. I didn't see that trope, and I'm happy about it in your work. But I'm just wondering, concerning this larger discussion about empirical work and theory, was there any encounter in your work which was shaking your discursive approach, where you thought, oh, probably I should rethink this?
I mentioned in the book that one of my research sources, I suppose, I went along to a local a food bank on a number of occasions as a sort of part of the ethnography, and the intention was to, you know, help me gain access to individuals who are somewhat outside of the system, lower in the socioeconomic spectrum, lower in that power index, who might not get the emails about are you a Southsider and so on, to have some more real conversations. I didn't feel it was appropriate after I didn't feel the power dynamic was appropriate for me to sort of sit down and interview these people who were sort of trapped in that dynamic, and I didn't feel I could ethically conduct formal interviews. But I was there for quite a few sessions, and just conversing and listening to the chats that were happening. And of course, people would ask what I was doing, and again, I used to be nervous about this influencing. When people ask what you're doing, and you say, "Oh, I study religion," and but I started to see that as a useful moment in how do they respond to when they hear about what I'm doing. What is the response? Then that is data in and of itself. And so some of those conversations where you have the sort of angels and ghosts and magic stuff, and not believing in God, but all of this conversation happening in a church at the same time, and people are messy, and it was probably those encounters that, you know, I would have loved to have been able to sit some people down for a longer interview, but those would be ones that I just would love to see that playing out more than just brief moments of discourse. I don't think I really addressed that well, but we are at time, and I know we all need a break. So thank you everyone for staying with me. And thanks to Linda Woodhead, Morteza Hashemi, Andie Alexander, and Paul-Francois Tremlett. Thanks to the conference organisers, and the link to the book is further up the chat. If this has piqued your interest, please do buy, and I look forward to seeing the review, Paul. All right, I'll see you all soon. Lovely to see everyone. Thanks so much.